take my mind. Don't let a memory taunt you me.
Willie Nelson is great at many, many things. By the time he ran into serious trouble with the IRS, Willie had already had a very successful career. He had spent 10 mediocre years in Nashville as an artist, but had found success as a songwriter, writing songs like Crazy by Patsy Cline and Hello Walls by Faron Young. But unable to make headway as an artist, he broke away from Nashville and moved to Austin, Texas, where he, along with a few others like Waylon Jennings, Chris Christopherson, and Jesse Coulter, created the outlaw country music movement. He had released historic albums such as Red-Headed Stranger and Stardust. He had won Entertainer of the Year, had started Farm Aid, the 4th of July picnics, and had more than 10 number one hits. To say Willie was one of the most highly successful country artists of all time would almost be an understatement. But one thing Willie isn't good at, and that is managing his money. In fact, he is quite terrible at it, as we will soon see. So how did Willie get into so much trouble with the IRS? Well, to understand the answer to that question, you first have to understand Wilie Nelson. You see, Willie loves music desperately. He has given his entire life to it. Waylon Jennings once said he had never seen any musician more happy to be behind a microphone than Willie Nelson. And you can imagine that Waylon had been around plenty of entertainers. If it didn't have to do with music, Willie Nelson just did not care. And that includes watching his money. He frankly just didn't care. Even during his first years in Nashville, when he started getting royalty checks for his songwriting, Willie liked to spend money. It wasn't so much that he was an extravagant spender. Well, I guess actually he was at times. For example, when he played bass in Ray Price's band, the Cherokee Cowboys, in the early 60s, he would fly to the next concert, while even Ray Price took the bus. So Willie did like to spend money, but he didn't spend it so much to be extravagant. He just spent money because he had it. When he didn't have the money, he didn't spend it. Either way, it made little difference to Willie. Now, money management, that was something for people that cared where their money went. Trust funds and retirement plans, they never interested Willie. Even when good-meaning people tried to educate Willie about his money, Willie would just get distracted, pick up his guitar, and start playing. As always, Willie just wanted to play music. Now, Willie had had some practice with the IRS earlier in life. Back in the late 60s, the IRS came calling for unpaid taxes, and in the early 70s, Willie had liens placed on his property due to tax trouble. The thing was, in the 1960s and early 70s, no one really knew who Willie Nelson was, and Willie certainly didn't have the money to be a big-time target for the IRS. But over time, Willie's income grew, especially between 1975, when Willie started his monumental rise with the release of Red-Headed Stranger, until 1985, when Willie was in the top 10 of the highest-grossing touring acts. During those years, Willie had bought property in 6 states, owned a private jet, was starring in his own movies, had visited the White House, was collaborating with the biggest musical stars of the day, and had his photos splashed all over newspapers, magazines, and television. The truth is, by now, Willie Nelson was a target. Now, because Willie didn't care to handle his own money, or really even care where it went, he left his financial matters to his manager, including paying his taxes. Now, Willie had known his manager for years. He had negotiated Willie a large contract when he signed with Columbia in 1975, guaranteeing Willie creative control over his music, which Willie then used to create music that started the outlaw movement. Unfortunately, it was also said of Willie's manager that if he was given the chance to tell the truth or tell a lie with both having the same consequence, he would prefer to tell the lie. So Willie's taxes didn't get paid. In 1979, the IRS confronted Willie about his back taxes. They were very curious about the years 1975 to 1978. Quite unfortunately, Willie's receipts and financial records for that time had disappeared, as in, they were completely gone. So the IRS wanted $2 million in back taxes to cover those years. Now clearly, this was a big problem. So Willie fired his manager and hired Pricewaterhouse, the well-known accounting firm, to help him out. Things didn't go any better with Pricewaterhouse. Under their advice, Willie invested in tax shelters that were later investigated by the IRS. When that ended up losing more money, he invested in cattle. Willie lost even more money. Over the years, more and more financial trouble kept building for Willie. The IRS continued to notify Willie that he was deficient in his taxes, but Willie kept ignoring them, which is rarely a good idea. Over a 10-year period during the 1980s, a combination of back taxes, interest, and penalties meant Wilie Nelson now owed $32 million in taxes. So why didn't Willie just pay his taxes the first time the IRS came calling, instead of letting them balloon up to $32 million? Well, the truth is, Willie just didn't have the money. Willie had either spent it or given it away. The money just wasn't there. And frankly, Willie didn't really care. He has always lived with the idea that everything will turn out fine. Was Willie going to take time away from his music to figure out this problem? He was not. Was Willie going to be stressed about the IRS? He was not. Did Willie care that he owed the IRS millions of dollars? Quite frankly, he did not. And if Willie wasn't able to pay his taxes during his heyday, he certainly wasn't going to be able to pay them by the end of the 1980s. In 1985, Willie was a very popular touring act. But by 1989, he was only the 46th most popular act and was bringing in much less money than earlier. His record sales had dipped dramatically as a younger cast of country stars like George Strait, Alabama, and Dwight Yoakam came along. While Willie was doing well enough for his family to live off of, he was no longer doing well enough to save a lot of money. Now, during all of this, Willie kept touring, and Willie kept making music, believing that things would eventually work out. Sure, he was stressed at times, but he was more stressed for the family and friends who relied on him, rather than over any consequences that might come to him personally. He always believed that, as long as he had his voice and his guitar, he could make a living. It didn't really matter to him if the IRS took everything else. He had lived by that motto since he was a teenager, and he believed if everything was taken from him, he'd still be just fine. But the IRS doesn't take payments in positive attitudes. They want the money. And Willie, he wasn't giving them any. Between the legalities and the courts and the notices and the mounting penalties, things were moving slowly, but they were definitely moving. Finally, the IRS had had enough. In November 1990, they seized Willie's properties and assets in all 6 states. They took everything they could get their hands on: his houses, his country club, his golf course, and his personal recording studio. Thankfully, about 2 weeks earlier, Willie sensed things were about to hit the fan, and he had his beloved guitar Trigger sent to his vacation spot in Hawaii out of the IRS's reach. In January 1991, just a few months after, the IRS put Willie's confiscated assets up for public auction. While there was plenty of interest since the items belonged to Wilie Nelson, frankly, a lot of the stuff just wasn't worth that much. Remember, Willie spent his time making music, not collecting fine art and gold watches. The auction wasn't nearly enough to satisfy Willie's debts. Now negotiations continued, and the IRS eventually dropped the taxes down to $9 million, of which $3 million had been paid. Now, having all of your assets taken by the government tends to make one realize the seriousness of the situation, and it had the same effect on Willie. So Willie kicked things into high gear to pay off his remaining debts.
Wilie Nelson. He's been there.
In probably one of the only deals of its kind, Willie and the IRS entered a revenue sharing agreement, which allowed Willie to record and release an album called The IRS Tapes, Who Will Buy My Memories? The IRS got a portion of any sales of that album, which turned out to be over $3 million. This, along with the settled lawsuits against his former manager and Price Waterhouse, also helped clear his debts. Finally, in 1993, all back taxes had been paid, and the 15-year saga with the IRS was finally put to rest. Now, there is some good news to all of this. In 1992, Willie was able to buy back his country club and golf course, and Willie's recording studio was auctioned off to Willie's nephew, who continues to run it today. Willie still records in that same studio as well. Now, as it turns out, Willie was right. He has been just fine. Since having his assets confiscated, he has continued to make music, and he, of course, continues to tour. He continues to put on Farm Aid. He has been inducted into multiple halls of fame. He has received an honorary doctorate, Lifetime Achievement Awards, and has had his music placed into the Grammy Hall of Fame and Library of Congress's National Recording Registry. Of course, we could talk for hours about Wilie Nelson's career since 1990, but that's a story for another day.